And we are back with another Cannabis Thought Leader series. Today we have Keith with us. Keith, how are you?
I'm just fine, thank you. It's an interesting time to be in Washington, D.C. with the transition underway. Can't say I'm terribly happy about the transition, but, it happens once every 4 years, so at least it's certainly not a boring time
It's
here.
not a boring time. So, before we get into that, and there is certainly plenty to talk about with the Trump administration, of course, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, what you're doing, let us get to know you a little bit better.
Sure. Well, first off, the most important factor probably is that I'm an old guy. I'm 73 years old.
Okay.
I first started smoking marijuana when I was a freshman at Georgetown Law School in 1965. So I guess I've been smoking for 51 years now. I think that qualifies as a regular user.
Okay.
I might just briefly tell you how I got involved in the issue in the first place. We founded NORML in late 1970. I graduated Georgetown Law School in 68, right at the heart of the anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and the anti-war demonstrations here in Washington. And my generation, and I'm certainly not unique in that sense, many of us were radicalized by that experience. I was a draft evader or a draft dodger. They had all kinds of terms they used to use to define people like me who tried very hard to stay out of the war.
Uh-huh.
And I was fortunate enough, I had the help of some lawyers from the National Lawyers Guild. And with their assistance, and with the fact that I had been offered a job when I graduated Georgetown by a presidential commission, it was called the National Commission on Product Safety. It was a result of the work Ralph Nader, consumer advocate Ralph Nader, had been doing. In any event, because of that, these lawyers applied for, and I received what was called a critical skills deferment. Back in those years, it was before the draft lottery, so that anyone 18 years old or older was automatically inducted into the Army unless you were a full-time student.
Uh-huh.
So, it certainly was a strong incentive to keep a lot of us in school for as long as possible, but nonetheless, by the time I graduated law school, I still had 2 years of draft eligibility, and so was very concerned about getting sent off to Vietnam and being killed. I had a number of my fraternity brothers from my undergraduate days who, in fact, had come back in pine boxes. So by that point, we were very much impacted by the anti-war movement. Well, when you went to those anti-war demonstrations, there was a lot of open marijuana smoking. It was as if lighting up a joint and passing it around to strangers was a way of showing symbolically our opposition to the war in Vietnam, but also our opposition to other policies of the government.
Uh-huh.
So, at any event, I ended up, rather than having to go to Vietnam, I worked at downtown Washington, D.C. at the Presidential Commission for the 2 years it was in existence. And then when it ended in 1968, or in 1970, I was too old to be drafted. So for the first time, I actually had a chance to give some thought about what I wanted to do. I had always assumed that one goes to law school simply to go back home and practice law and make money and lead a boring life. I'd never heard of public interest law at the time. I was raised in Southern Illinois.
Uh-huh.
But because of my work at the National Commission on Product Safety and working around Ralph Nader, I was introduced to this concept that you could use your law degree on policy, not just to try to get rich or try to get clients rich. And so I decided I was really fascinated by this concept of public interest law, but frankly, I wasn't that interested in product safety. What interested me, because I started smoking back in '65 when I was a freshman at Georgetown, I wanted to legalize marijuana, and I was naive enough and maybe idealistic enough to think that it's something we might be able to accomplish. And so in late 1970, I sat down with a few friends and colleagues here in Washington, D.C., and we founded NORML. And from the very first day, it was established as a consumer lobby. That is, our purpose was to represent the interest of marijuana smokers, not the industry, but the individual smokers. And to this day, that is still NORML's mission.
I see. Interesting. Well, you are undoubtedly one of the founders of the community, and I think you and your organization has had a tremendous influence on the landscape, the legal landscape of marijuana in this country. Um, Tell us a little bit more about what NORML does. Of course, many people have heard of it and we're familiar with the organization, but, on a day-to-day level, how is it interfacing with policymakers, with local community members? What do you guys do exactly?
Well, number one, we do a great deal of lobbying. The nuts and bolts of changing public policy in this country involves whether it's on the city council level or the state legislative level or even in Congress. It requires people to roll up their sleeves and get to work. We have to spend time with those elected officials. We have to make sure that we're well informed with the data so that when we have access to sit down to an elected official, we have a shot to convince them that prohibition is a failed public policy. We don't approach it on the basis that they ought to turn on or that, everybody in America ought to get high. Frankly, I think it's a lot of fun getting high, and I'm amazed that more people don't. But the fact is, I don't really care whether a lot of Americans smoke marijuana. What I care about is I don't want responsible marijuana smokers treated like criminals. And for 80 years in this country, that's precisely the case. Since 1972, more than 26 million Americans have been arrested on marijuana charges. So the first thing we do here is we try to eliminate criminal penalties for the responsible use of marijuana. We also lobby for the laws allowing seriously ill patients to use marijuana as a medicine. In fact, we brought the first legal action to try to make marijuana available as a medicine, get it to a lower schedule way back in 1972, which is May 73, maybe we filed the first suit on that. And here we are all these decades later, and it's still on Schedule 1, an ignorant place to have it under federal law, but that's where it is. But ultimately, our goal is not just to make marijuana legal as a medicine and not just to stop arresting smokers. We want marijuana to be legal. We want it to be affordable. We want it to be safe and convenient. And when I say safe, we want the marijuana tested in a laboratory, in a state-certified lab, so we know, for example, that the marijuana we're buying does not have molds or pesticides. We also want labeling, so we know precisely the level of THC or CBD. And we want a legal market where we can buy the marijuana so we don't have to go in some back alley and buy it on the black market. So again, all of our efforts, or most of our efforts, are aimed at moving state by state and eventually on the federal level, moving the country away from criminal prohibition of marijuana and towards the eventual full legalization and regulation of marijuana. Now, there is real quickly a second thing we do as well. At NORML, we have something called the NORML Legal Committee, which is comprised of 500 or 600 used to be criminal defense lawyers from all around the country. Now, today, a fair slice of those lawyers have become marijuana business lawyers. They're representing people who've come above ground and now are licensed to commercially cultivate or sell marijuana, either for medical use or for full legalization. Obviously, what we need to be doing is, until we can get marijuana legal, we feel an obligation to represent the best we can to provide assistance to those marijuana smokers who are caught up in the criminal justice system. So every day I probably get 10, 20 calls from people around the country who've been arrested, who don't know what they need to be doing. They've never been caught up in the criminal justice process before. So we do a couple of things. We familiarize them with the process. We let them know what to expect at their initial preliminary hearing, and we explain to them what a motion to suppress the evidence is all about, because in a drug case, you either win it with motion to suppress the evidence or you can't win it at all because they caught you with the marijuana. And we try to make sure that we can help them find competent legal counsel to help them get through the process with the least amount of harm. And that means trying to find members of the NORML legal committee who are in their part of the country and connect the two of them up. So our work is divided between trying to change the laws to legalize marijuana on one hand, on the other hand, trying to help victims of the current prohibition.
You know, I'm really interested in one of the things you said in kind of the first legs of action that you're working on, which is this push for greater regulation and government oversight to ensure the quality of the plant itself. So what would your position then be on, a person growing it in their backyard for their own use? Is that something that should be included in these programs, or how do you feel about that?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I would tell you that from the very first days of NORML, we have argued for the consumer's right to grow their own marijuana. Even in a state where marijuana is legal, we think consumers still should have the option of growing their own marijuana for personal use if they prefer to do that, rather than buying it at a regulated, licensed retail outlet. Now, to be realistic, most Americans, there was something like 37 million Americans smoked marijuana in the last year. Most of them are not going to develop the expertise or to spend the time and effort to learn to cultivate and grow high quality marijuana at home. It isn't that simple. I mean, there's a great deal of skill involved. It's certainly something you can learn, but it's not just, it involves a lot more than just dropping a few seeds in the ground and watering them once in a while.
Of course.
So just as we are allowed to make, I think, 50 gallons of beer in our basement, very few of us do that. I go to the supermarket and buy beer when I want beer. It's just convenient and affordable, so why bother to make my own? And I think the same will be true with marijuana. But nonetheless, even though most people will opt for the convenience of buying marijuana from a legal outlet, they certainly should have the right to grow their own if they prefer that option.
Okay. Well, and feel free to opt out of this next question if it feels slightly too abstract. But, in the famous and indeed seminal case of Gonzalez v. Reich, we had a woman, of course, I think this was maybe in 2005, something like that.
Angel Reich, sure.
Reich.
You had two women. There were two cases that were combined.
Right, of course, two women, but... Right.
I think the other one's name may have been Munson, but I forget now. It's been too long. But go ahead.
But in any event, the thrust of the case was whether or not the DEA, under its Controlled Substance Act, could regulate the growth, the individual's personal growth of the herb for their own medicinal benefits, and whether or not that was an unconstitutional application of the Commerce Clause. So and the idea there is that. Drawing on past precedent, the Filburn case, where if one person were to do something that would affect interstate commerce, the aggregate effect of many people doing that same thing would ultimately affect interstate commerce, and therefore Congress was within its duty to use the commerce powers in order to regulate cannabis in this way. So, I was just wondering what you thought about that as a constitutional matter.
First off, I think that was a terrible decision. It was based on an earlier Supreme Court case handed down in, I believe, the 1930s, having to do with wheat, the cultivation of wheat.
The Filburn case.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
And so I understand why the court reached that decision, but I still think it was a bad decision. Again, here's what people need to understand: a little bit of background of constitutional law. A state does not have to justify passing a criminal law. They have what's called the inherent right to pass criminal laws. But the federal government does not. The federal government can only pass a criminal law if they can point to a specific provision in the Constitution that justifies it. And under most federal criminal penalties, the justification is that it has an impact on interstate commerce, and therefore that gives the federal government the authority to pass these laws. Well, if you were really applying that in any kind of fair manner, when Angel Reich was growing a couple of marijuana plants for her own use, it didn't travel across state lines. There was no money traded hands with anybody. It's not realistic to suggest that has the slightest impact on interstate commerce. But as you pointed out, based on some far-fetched rationalization that if 1 million people each grew a couple of plants, then the cumulative effect would be significant, and therefore it has an impact on interstate commerce. Again, I think what really happened there was, it was interesting. The liberals on the court voted against us on that one. It was the conservatives that were basically questioning the court's or the Congress's ability to even pass that law. And the reason the liberals were against us wasn't that they were wanting to treat marijuana as a crime. It was because I think they were concerned that if you began to undermine the way the interstate commerce provisions were interpreted, then much of the New Deal, much of the progressive provisions of government passed from Roosevelt on may in fact be invalid. And so they weren't willing to take that big a leap. I think if this would have simply involved marijuana and had no impact on broader policy, we would have probably won that case.
Interesting.
But nonetheless, for the moment, we're stuck with it. And again, what the Supreme Court said was not that the federal law overruled the state law. What they said was both levels of government have concurrent rights to pass marijuana laws. And so what that leaves us with is a situation like we have today, where we have 29 states that have legalized medical use. We have 8 states that have legalized recreational use. And yet all marijuana smoking and possession and sale is illegal under federal law. Both levels of government have passed laws, and they certainly don't agree with each other, but they're both valid for the moment.
Well, we do also have the Supremacy Clause, which, of course, says that in the event that a federal law conflicts with the state law, the federal law will trump it.
Well, by the way, the Supremacy Clause is interesting. The way the court applies it is more limited than you would expect.
Uh-huh.
What the court says is, if a state law and the federal law create what they call a positive conflict, and that's a term that has been interpreted throughout a number of cases. If there's a positive conflict, then the Supremacy Clause kicks in, and the federal law overrules the state law. But most of the laws that states and the federal government have that may not be identical are not considered positive conflicts. However, here's where it gets a little dangerous, having Jeff Sessions about to be our next Attorney General.
Uh-huh.
Almost all legal observers concede that if the Department of Justice on the federal level wanted to shut down the commercial aspects of the federal legalization laws, both medical and full legalization, they could almost certainly go into federal court and seek an injunction, and the court would likely grant it. That would shut down the commercial licensing, the licensing of commercial growers and commercial sellers. But a state does not have an obligation to mimic federal law. So there's nothing the Trump administration could do, or Jeff Sessions could do, for example, to require Colorado to recriminalize marijuana. There is no legal theory under which they could require that. So what you would be left with would be all of these states that have removed criminal penalties for minor marijuana offenses, either for medical use or for recreational use. That would still be legal under state law. There would be no state law against it. But there would be no legal market for the marijuana. So what you would have is an incredibly thriving black market. You would have a situation that I don't think the Trump administration or Jeff Sessions really wants to walk into. Secondly, you're talking about an industry that's already estimated to exceed, I think, $6 billion a year, and suggestions are that once the state of California comes online over the next year and a half, that state alone will sell $6 billion worth of marijuana a year, and the taxes they raise will be approximately $1 billion a year. They're in the state of Colorado and Washington and Oregon, for example, there are literally tens of thousands of new jobs that have been created because of state legal marijuana. So I'm not sure that the Republicans who talk so much about states' rights and talk so much about wanting to create jobs, I'm not sure how anxious they're going to be to try to shut down those commercial systems. But It's a risky time, and I think right now none of us know for sure how that's going to resolve itself.
There is something interesting and slightly confusing, at least, um, I suppose, on a strictly abstract level of theory, how on the one hand Republicans have adopted this mantra of protecting the 10th Amendment. The Republicans are very big, of course, into federalism, and yet on this one particular issue, the Republican Party does not seem to be as willing to allow the states to work with cannabis how they want to. It's a strange thing, almost as if the religious imperative, at least on the fundamentalist right, seems to be trumping some of the libertarian theories that underpin parts of the Republican Party as well.
Yeah, I would say it's the moral opposition to marijuana. Those who, like Jeff Sessions, recently said, good people don't smoke marijuana. For those people who believe that marijuana is an evil substance and they have a moral aversion to it,
right.
They're going to oppose legal marijuana despite the fact that they would, on most other issues, say the states have the right to make their own decisions. But interestingly, there's the flip side of that. Those of us who are more progressive, but who are legalizers, we are thoroughly enjoying the states' rights approach to this one, because right now we don't have sufficient support in Congress in federal marijuana prohibition. But we do have sufficient support in many states to do that. So we're only too happy to argue states' rights and to work at the state level until we build sufficient support to move Congress. Now, keep in mind, for many of us, states' rights is an expression we first heard about when it was used to justify segregation.
Right.
So just as the Republicans now kind of flip-flop when they all of a sudden they don't believe in states' rights when it talks about marijuana, all of a sudden we progressives that thought states' rights was a very dangerous policy when it was being used to justify segregation,
right.
We're all too happy to take advantage of it now to legalize marijuana. So I suppose we all, to some degree, exercise situational ethics.
Right. Exactly. The moral ambiguity of it really seems to line up with however we want it to. Unfortunately, there is no clear fault line on every policy issue between the parties. That is very interesting. So, we're talking about Trump, we're talking about Jeff Sessions. On the most fundamental level, do you think the community should be worried, should be concerned? Where does that leave us right now, 10 days before Trump enters office?
I do indeed think we should be worried and concerned, and in fact, NORML, as well as several other drug law reform groups, we've spent the last couple of days generating tens of thousands of phone calls to members of the U.S. Senate from their constituents, urging them to demand that Sessions clarify his position on marijuana, and unless he's willing to support states' rights and keep the federal government out of the picture, to vote against his confirmation.
Oh.
Now, I don't think we're going to succeed with that. I think, the Republicans have the votes, and he's a member of the club, and so regardless of how much opposition is expressed, I suspect he is going to be our next Attorney General. But it's still important for those of us who care about legalizing marijuana to remain involved. It is no time to hide with your head under the pillow. There's a temptation at times like this to say, man, I can't deal with an administration as backward and as hostile to civil rights and civil liberties as the Trump administration. We don't have any choice. We must deal with it, and we must because we do not want them to roll back the gains we've made over the last 10 or so years. I'm old enough to remember the Nixon administration, and as much as I hated those years, the fact is we survived those years, and in fact, we managed to get the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse established under President Nixon. It wasn't because of him. It was because of some friends in Congress that included a provision in the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. But because of the Marijuana Commission, they came out with a report in 72 recommending that we stop arresting marijuana smokers altogether. And based on that, we decriminalized marijuana in 11 states between 1972 and 1978. when the mood of the country turned more conservative, and then we didn't win another statewide victory for 18 years. And when we did come back with the victory, it was in 1996 in California, and it was in the form of the medical use of marijuana. The consensus of the public had switched from focusing on only decriminalizing marijuana to the positive aspects that marijuana can help seriously ill patients. So, having seen lived through those dark days, I recognize that we can live through a Trump administration. It's not what I wanted, and I think it's not what the majority of marijuana smokers wanted, but it is what we're faced with. So our only choice is let's make the best of it, and let's figure out ways that we can make, even if small incremental steps, let's make some progress even under a potentially hostile administration.
Well, and for business owners and entrepreneurs who are interested in opening up their dispensaries, in respective states with at least medical marijuana programs, if not full recreational programs, is it still a smart business investment? I mean, do you think at this point, given the political uncertainty of a Jeff Sessions Justice Department, would it be unwise for someone to invest all that time, money, and energy into opening up a dispensary?
I had a call 10 days ago or something from someone asking me specifically if I would be kind enough to give them some suggestions and advice on when and where they should invest in the legal marijuana industry. They obviously had some resources, but they weren't sure where they should be looking. And I told them the same as I would tell you now. If I had resources, I would sit on them for the moment. I think it would be foolish indeed to invest new resources at this moment until we get some sense of exactly what the Trump administration expects to do. What I imagine will happen is that they will continue a version of the Obama policy, which basically was, so long as the state legalization systems were careful not to allow marijuana to be accessible by juveniles, and as long as they continued to fight to keep marijuana from being exported from a legalization state to a state next door where it's still criminalized. There were 3 or 4 or 5 basic issues, and under those series of Cohn memos, the Obama administration said if the states will take care to pay attention to these issues, we're going to keep the federal government out of it. We're going to let the states experiment and implement these new laws. I think we will see a similar outcome under the Trump administration, but again, no one can know for certain, and because of the possibility that Trump might be focused on other issues and Jeff Sessions might have the ability to go off on his own and do it, if I had a large amount of money, I'd keep it invested in something more secure for the moment. And over the next 2 or 3 or 4 months, I think we'll have a much better idea of whether it's a reasonable, safe investment to make.
Well, what would the threshold issue or statement or indication be from the administration to know? I mean, you're kind of in the trenches on the policy side, but if you're just a consumer, a business owner, an entrepreneur, you go on different websites, you read statements, but how does a person know where the Trump administration, really stands? I mean, what would knowing look like?
What I think, obviously, most lawyers would counsel their clients in this area, keep your head low for a while. I don't mean turn your sign off or close your business. No. If you're in a state where marijuana has been legalized and you've got an ongoing successful business, more power to you, and keep it going. But it would not be a time, for example, if they don't allow billboard advertising in your state,
right,
then this is not a time where I'd want to be erecting a billboard,
right.
Pushing the envelope, because right. I think to do so, you're really asking for trouble. It would give Jeff Sessions an easy excuse to move in with federal law and close you down.
Right.
So, again, it's not a time to blow smoke in their face. It's a time to work hard, keep your head down, and let's see how this works out over the coming 2 or 3 months. It's not going to be, within a reasonable period of time, they're either going to shut down the commercialization of marijuana in the states that have legalized it, or they're not. And if they haven't in the next 6 months, then I think probably it's a go sign for the next 4 years. We're okay. But I would think most attorneys would counsel clients that it really is a time for consolidation. It's a time for to make sure your business practices are all in order, that your accounting is in order. If you find yourself up against an audit, make sure that your books are in order. It's not a time to push the envelope, and it's certainly not a time to blow smoke in the face of the other side.
I see. Okay, very interesting. Well, we're moving towards the end of the discussion. I just really want to give you an opportunity to tell people, what should people know about what NORML is doing now, how to get involved, and how to, better contribute to the community vis-a-vis your organization.
Well, first off, NORML is comprised of something like 130 state and local NORML organizations. Some are citywide, some are statewide, some are based on universities, and we have NORML groups that operate in more than a dozen, I think more than 15 foreign countries right now. So the first step I would suggest is see if you can go to the NORML website and see if there is a NORML organization already up and running in your part of the state or in your part of the country. If there is, get in touch, offer to help, get to know the other people who are interested in this issue, become part of the solution. Don't just sit home on the sofa and expect somebody else to do the work for you. I would also say that when you go to the NORML homepage, and it's just where you'd expect it, NORML.org, we're a nonprofit, you'll see on the upper right-hand corner, you can sign up for a free alert or a news release we put out once a week. It doesn't cost anything at all, and if you'll sign up to that, then you'll receive one or two alerts from us every week, letting you know the 3 or 4 major pieces of legislation that have been introduced around the country and whether you should be supporting or opposing them. And we also offer sample letters so that it makes it easy for you to weigh in and get your vote counted. In today's world, it's changed a lot. During the early days of NORML, we had to print newsletters and send them out and put on postage. It ended up costing about $1 a person anytime you wanted to communicate with a member. Today, because of high tech and social network sites and email lists, etc., when we need to get the word out about an issue, we can push a button and reach about 1,400,000 people without a dime. It doesn't cost a dime. Now, it costs some money to set the system up, but it doesn't cost any money once it's set up. So please sign up. We'd love to have your financial support, of course, but perhaps even more importantly, sign up for that free e-zine so that we can keep you apprised when you need to get involved. We'll let you know when there's been a bill introduced in your state or in Congress that you need to support or oppose. So my main message would be this. This is only incidentally about marijuana. I love smoking pot. As I say, I've been smoking for 51 years. But the reality is this is only incidentally about marijuana. It's really about personal freedom. And if we can have the support and assistance of the tens of millions of Americans who smoke marijuana responsibly, we can return a measure of personal freedom to the lives of marijuana smokers all across this great country.
Wonderful, wonderful. Wow. Well, listen, this was a real pleasure for me personally, and of course I think our audience is going to get a lot out of this. Look, Keith, we'd love to have you on again in the future.
Call anytime, and not just to be on the air, but if you have questions about policy issues that we can help you with, call anytime, and we'd be glad to be of assistance.
Beautiful. Okay, well, another great interview with THC Legal Group's podcast Thought Leader series. This is Abe Cohn. Until next time.